So, picture this, Cold War Berlin. It's a city that's literally split in two, and it is absolutely crawling with spies. We're talking about the white-hot center of global espionage.
Now get this, in the mid-1950s, the West dropped $6.5 million on a single operation in that city. And that's over $60 million in today's money. All for a top-secret project they were convinced would give them the ultimate edge over the Soviets.
The plan itself, it was something straight out of a movie. They were going to build a secret tunnel almost half a mile long, right from the American sector, deep into Soviet territory in East Berlin. And the target? Tapping directly into the main communication lines of the Soviet military headquarters.
But here is the massive, mind-bending question that changes everything. What if, while the West was pouring all this money and effort into their high-tech spy tunnel, they weren't the masterminds at all? What if the whole thing was just an elaborate puppet show, and the KGB was pulling all the strings?
Okay, so let's get into it. This huge, audacious plan, it didn't just come out of thin air. The whole idea was actually based on a smaller, successful test run they'd done before.
See, it all started with Operation Silverback, back in '49. The British had managed to tap into Soviet cables in Vienna, and it worked like a charm. It was such a success that they thought, okay, let's do this again, but bigger. So they teamed up with the Americans to go for the gold, literally. The new, much more ambitious project in Berlin was codenamed Operation Gold.
And I mean, the sheer engineering of this thing was incredible. Just imagine trying to dig a 600-meter tunnel, 5 meters underground, right under a heavily guarded border, without anyone noticing. They had to haul out over 3,000 tons of dirt, and they did it all under the perfect cover story. They were just building a new US radar station. The Americans on the ground even gave it a nickname, Harvey's Hole, after the local CIA station chief. A little bit of dark humor there.
So, you've got this amazing technical achievement, all this secrecy, but the entire operation had a fatal flaw. And it wasn't a piece of technology, it was a person, one of Britain's own most trusted intelligence officers.
And to understand why, you just have to hear the words of the man himself, MI6 agent George Blake. He said this about his time in the Korean War. What he saw there, it didn't just change his mind, it completely shattered his loyalty to the West and pushed him to a new ideology. I mean, this timeline is just unbelievable. Blake gets captured in Korea, and while he's a prisoner of war, he voluntarily becomes a communist and offers to spy for the Soviet Union. Then, he gets released, comes home to London, and he's treated like a hero. And then, in a twist of fate you just couldn't make up, he gets promoted to a senior job in the exact department that's planning the Berlin Tunnel.
Just think about this for a second. The very first meeting where Operation Gold was even discussed, it was top secret. Only 9 people in the room, and one of them was George Blake. He walked right out of that meeting and handed the entire blueprint over to his KGB handlers. The tunnel was completely compromised before a single shovel ever hit the ground.
So the KGB has just been handed this incredible intelligence gift on a silver platter. What do? Well, they make a brilliant and totally counterintuitive move. They decide to just let the West build the tunnel. Which, of course, makes you ask the obvious question, why on earth would you do that? Why would you sit back and watch your enemies spend millions of dollars to tunnel right under your feet? Well, the answer shows a real masterclass in spycraft. You see, the KGB was playing a much bigger game here. Priority number 1, protect George Blake. He was way too valuable an asset to risk exposing. Second, if they controlled the phone lines, they could control the information. They could feed the West a carefully prepared diet of truth and lies. And third, and this is maybe the most important, at the height of the Cold War, they could use the tunnel to let the US overhear conversations that were specifically designed to convince them the Soviets weren't planning a surprise nuclear attack. It was a way to de-escalate tensions. So for almost a year, the CIA and MI6 think they've hit the intelligence jackpot. They're intercepting thousands of conversations, writing all these reports, thinking they're getting the inside scoop on Soviet military plans. But in reality, they were listening to a broadcast that was being personally curated for them by the KGB. All the really important calls were rerouted. What they got was a mix of harmless gossip, some boring but real data to make it seem legit, and a whole lot of disinformation. But of course, all good things must come to an end. After about 11 months, the KGB decided the game was up. But they weren't just going to quietly shut it down. Oh no. The discovery of the tunnel was going to be a full-blown piece of political theater staged for maximum impact on the world stage. And the timing, it was just surgical. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev is in the middle of a historic state visit to the UK. Right then, the Soviets claim that some heavy rain caused a cable fault, and, what do you know, their repair crews accidentally stumble upon this massive spy tunnel. They immediately call a press conference, it becomes this huge international scandal, and crucially, Khrushchev very publicly blames only the Americans. It was a brilliant political move designed to embarrass the US while trying to drive a wedge between the Western allies.
And to make the story even better, the Soviets added this perfect little detail for the media. They claimed the American and British spies fled in such a panic that they left a coffee pot still boiling on the stove. It was pure propaganda genius, a memorable, vivid image of spies being caught completely red-handed.
For the Soviet Union, this was a massive propaganda victory. Their newspapers splashed pictures of the tunnel all over the front pages with these triumphant headlines. And for the West, especially the United States, it was just a moment of deep public humiliation.
So that brings us to the big central debate of this whole story. How do we judge Operation Gold? Was it a brilliant intelligence success, or was it one of the most expensive and embarrassing failures in the history of espionage? And honestly, the answer really depends on who you ask. For decades, the CIA's official line was this: the operation was a huge success. They argued that even though it only lasted 11 months, the sheer volume of intelligence they gathered on the Soviet military was absolutely invaluable and totally worth the cost and the risk.
But, and this is a pretty huge but, that entire argument kind of falls apart when you remember this one devastating fact. The whole thing was compromised from day one. It doesn't matter how much information you gather if your enemy is the one deciding what you get to hear. The entire foundation of the operation was a lie.
The fallout was pretty significant. The head of the CIA, Alan Dulles, was eventually forced to resign after this and a few other failures. George Blake, the mole at the center of it all, was finally exposed in 1961. He was sentenced to 42 years in prison, but pulled off a dramatic escape and fled to Moscow, where he was welcomed as a hero and lived out the rest of his life. And as for the intelligence they gathered, to this day, nobody really knows what was real and what was fake. Its true value is still a total mystery. And that really leaves us with a final, fascinating thought. The CIA celebrated this thing as a success for years, all while being completely unaware that they were the ones being played. It makes you ask, in this wilderness of mirrors that is espionage, when one side doesn't even realize they've lost the game, who really won?